million on which we started to negotiate because we want the greater part back. But it's not asking the community for money, it is asking the community to have our own money back.
I mean, the case was absolutely cast down.
From the outset of our membership, we felt that we were paying much too large a share.
It was perhaps one of the first times, by no means the last time, that people realised that they had perhaps misjudged what modern Britain was like and what it was about.
It was the worst-tempered summit Mrs. Thatcher or any of the other leaders has attended. And even when they gathered for their usual team photo, the glumness seemed to show through. By 1 o'clock, there was almost a complete breakdown, and strenuous efforts were needed to get a compromise between the French and German leaders on the one hand and Britain on the other.
I always remember her banging the table at the 1979 European Summit in Dublin, when I actually asked her the question, what is this really about? And she said, Mr. Palmer, it is about getting my money back, banging the table. And then that was the moment I realised that this had a kind of ideological significance quite beyond the figures.
It is asking the community to have our own money back.
There are times when diplomacy requires a tough stance, and the rebate negotiations was certainly one of them. They were trying to roll her over. They were trying to roll her over, actually, with a lot of male chauvinism, and she stood her ground. Good luck to her.
After repeated rebuffs by General de Gaulle, Britain finally joined the European Economic Community in 1973. Most of the community budget was spent on a common agricultural policy. With a relatively small farming sector, Britain didn't seem to be getting much back for its money.
The French had fixed things in the meantime so that the CAP was in a form which was extremely advantageous to France and not very advantageous to us. And the arrangements for budget contributions, the so-called own resources system, again had been fixed by the French in a way which meant that we were going to make an above average contribution.
What everybody knew at the time was that Britain was going to pay more into the European Union budget, like Germany, compared with what it got out. But the argument was, and this was in the public domain, don't worry about that. We will make such a killing on the export markets that the premium payment of getting into the club by paying in more to the budget than you get back is well worth it. What went wrong was that the British policymakers hadn't realised the extent to which Britain's competitiveness had declined through the 1950s, 1960s, so that when Britain did join, actually they were disappointed in the success of British industry. So that left the budget payments looking as though they were unacceptably large.
And it became very obvious, which really stayed with us the next 2.5 years when I was Foreign Secretary, that we would have to do something about the financial arrangements, because after the initial period, it was coming out, the arithmetic was extremely bad for Britain.
In 1979, the British budget deal was up for review, and Britain had a new Prime Minister with a distinctive approach.
Schmidt of Germany and Giscard of France set out to bully her, and they found that that actually wasn't very successful, and she really was the Iron Lady.
Digging your heels in to the extent that you have right up to the last minute of this meeting, do you think that you've lost yourself friends in Europe?
Well, I hope not. But I have to dig my heels in. What Britain is being asked to contribute is unjust, inequitable, and unacceptable, and totally unfair to the British people.
Instead of growing our way out of the imbalance in the budget pattern of payments and contributions, under Margaret Thatcher, it became a kind of jihad, a kind of holy war.
I tabled a proposal in Brussels in February, asking for a return of 2/3 of our net contribution. And that wasn't at all popular, as you can imagine.
Meetings of EC leaders and their foreign ministers came and went, with little progress for Britain. Then, in Brussels, a breakthrough, after an all-night session of talks.
We emerged with Carrington and Sir Ian Gilmore. I emerged rather pleased with ourselves because we got a lump sum from 1980, 81, 82, which actually amounted to about 2/3 of our estimated net contribution. And Lord Carrington Gilmore set off checkers where Margaret Thatcher was. I gave them a couple of bottles of champagne to keep them going on the plane. And then when they got there, they found that she wasn't pleased at all. And it took them all day to persuade her.
But it was a temporary solution, and by 1983, the rebate issue was back on the agenda. Another summit, this time in Stuttgart. Britain wanted a long-term solution, and its diplomats had devised a new formula based on increasing the share of value-added tax revenue on which the community budget depended. But first, they had to persuade Mrs. Thatcher.
After about, I did a 2.5 hours argument, and she said, oh, well, all right, you got something for me to say tomorrow, and we'll look at it at breakfast at 7. So, but I drafted something to say the next day, and she approved it after going through it very carefully. Always went through it line by line.
Then they just had to win over their European partners. In March 1984, they assembled in Brussels for some full and frank exchanges.
The talks went on late that evening, again in 2 sessions, because the heads of government had their formal dinner together. And then tackled it after dinner and said, no, I don't think there was any real understanding or wish to understand between our colleagues. Margaret Thatcher struggled with the whole. And we, foreign secretaries, didn't make much of a thought of tackling it either. We adjourned before the heads of government finished. And most of our colleagues were going off to sleep. I started looking like a wartime waiting station in a crew station.
Undeterred, the British pressed on to the summit that June in Fontainebleau, convinced they had the right formula. This time, the French proved keener to listen. Was it the chemistry?
It was really de Gaulle who stopped Britain joining, and it was a great tragedy. So he came in and had a very good relationship with Pompidou, and that definitely helped. Thatcher, and she didn't really have a great relationship with anyone, but there was a sort of wary regard from Mitterrand. The rapport was very important because we weren't going to reach an agreement unless there was a sense of common purpose. And at that time, certainly, I think every head of state was anxious to promote their national interests. But there was a wider realization that we should try very hard.
Okay, hi everyone, and we need to start our class, and so I have to remember that the first thing we have to do is do attendance for policymaking in the European Union. So we go to, let me see, I want to make sure I'm always sharing screen, and so we go to share screen, and so we're sharing the screen here in attendance, and we're in week 3. So let's see, go to week 3, smart attendance, yes. So, and we start attendance, and there is the number, and the horses are out. So you have 10 minutes to enter in this code number, 575, to indicate that you are here. And I think I just let that run on its own while I go back to the class. And okay, so let's go back to the class, and let's see, stop share, go back to the class, and screen share, and let's see what I have open here. All right, so I need to open up the lesson plan. Yay, the lesson plan. And I got to remember to move my microphone so it's a little bit easier to hear me. The lesson plan for today, and here is the lesson plan, and make sure I share screen. I always got to remember to share screen, right? Share screen, and there's the lesson plan. And this just contains links and things I might use today. Some I'll use, some I won't. I'm using one on the Fontainebleau agreement that Britain would have a permanent rebate on its contribution to the European Union budget. I decided to look more into that because one of you, I think at the last class, mentioned that, one of our European students, and which means that if you know that and you're young people and you know about the British rebate, it's obviously made a big impact in Europe if you know about the British rebate. And clearly the British rebate wasn't successful in keeping Britain in the European Union. Although, again, we don't really know what it means to leave the European Union for Britain. Before I forget, this is our short class, right? I already posted online the assignment for Wednesday, which is to write, like you did last week, a 150-word pro or con paragraph, this time on the week 3 debate topic, right? And to submit that through Cyber Campus. That worked really nicely. A lot of the a lot of the Korean students submitted their assignments through Cyber Campus, and it works really nicely. And so why don't you go ahead and submit it through Cyber Campus? I have to work on that because if I want you to submit revisions of homework, of paragraphs or the midterm or the final, I'm wondering if I can just if I can just ask you to resubmit through Cyber Campus, even though the old draft of your assignment is still there, or do I have to create a new assignment so that you can upload the revision? And I think some of you indicated to me that you can't upload again once you upload once. And I'm not certain. So I want to investigate further on that, whether you can upload more than one file on one assignment, like a revised homework, and keep the original submission there as well. And then you submit a second revision, a second file, if you can keep both of those files there, right? So I want to investigate that more. And so again, to prepare for our debate on Friday on this topic, to South Koreans, the U.S. role in post-war European integration means that the European Union serves U.S. hegemony in the past, today, and into the future. In other words, the European Union is never going to be able to stand up to the United States on issues, for example, regarding, let's say, attacking Iran. If the United States decides to bomb Iran, the Europeans may be very unhappy about it, but it's doubtful, some might argue, that the Europeans would ever risk destroying the NATO alliance or pushing the U.S. out of the NATO alliance by standing up to the U.S. if the U.S. does something which which the European Union thinks is a very bad, catastrophic policy maneuver. Now that I think about it, back in 2003, when the United States was preparing to invade Iraq, the French government and the German government opposed that. They thought that would be a disaster. That was wrong. Don't do it, America. We won't support it. And the French would not permit a UN Security Council approval for the American impending invasion of Iraq, and the invasion was supported by other European Union members like Britain at the time, Italy, Spain, and not to mention the future members of the former communist countries that were going to join in 2004. They all supported it. Of course, so the European Union wasn't unified on that case, but it was a disastrous policy in the view of Paris and Berlin, but it didn't lead to European Union in the 16 years since then, or 17 years since then, separating itself from the United States. So, and of course, this goes back to the establishment of the European Union, the beginnings of European integration policies that began right after World War II, when the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was beginning, right? And so please submit your paragraphs by Wednesday, 7 o'clock, and the same rules apply. I will go through them. Remember, be sure to use and cite specific information from the assigned reading to support, develop, and refine your points. And some other points, please remember that no more than 10% of any of your homework should be quoted text. So if your paragraph is 150 words in length, no more than 15 words should be quoted text. Rephrase the information that you find in the reading or any research in your own words, but of course you still have to provide an in-text source citation for that source of information, right? Even if you put it in your own words, you still have to give the source where you found that, who provided that information that you were rephrasing in your own words, okay? And I want to make sure, by the way, that we are recording, and so we stop share. I just want to make sure, yeah, we're still recording. Good, good, good. So screen share and back to the screen share here. And that leads into a discussion of the Cold War and the foundation of the European Union. How about this? Okay. See, this is our short class, so there's a lot I want to cover here, in the remaining 40 minutes. So here are the notes, and let me resume share here, and it won't let me resume share, so I have to go back to the, let's see here, stop share, and then we have to go back to this, close that, share screen, and okay, the notes. Okay, here are the notes. So how did we get here to the European Union in 2018 when this book was published, or 2020 today? You know, is the European Union a system which emerged because of American influence? Does the European Union depend upon the United States and United States hegemony, United States domination in order to allow it to happen? You know, the prevailing view, not the only view, as I told you, I think in previous classes in the United States, is that yes, the European Union exists because the United States provided security for all the European countries in the European Union, so the Germans and the French don't have to worry about going to war with each other because the Americans will never allow it. The Americans will never allow France to attack Germany, or never allow Germany to attack France. And so they know this, Germany and France, and so they're able to cooperate because they don't have to worry about what's called the security dilemma, right? That in a world where there is no overarching world government, every country is responsible for their own well-being, according to this neo-realist argument. Neo-realism is one of the major fields in international relations, right? And so since Germany ultimately Germany can only rely on Germany, or the United States can only rely on the United States to take care of the United States. They can't rely upon the world government or the United Nations because it's not effective, right? Compare, for example, a situation here in Korea. I don't have to worry about defending myself from being attacked and killed by somebody who wants to take my money and my wallet or my computer, because I believe that the Korean government is strong and the Korean police is strong and people fear and respect the Korean government. Right? So I don't have to worry about people stabbing me in the back and taking my money because they think they can get away with it and nobody will catch them. But in the world level, at the level of international relations, there is no world government. There is no world police force, right? There is no authority that everybody can trust to take care of them, more or less. And so Germany has to prepare for the worst. France has to prepare for the worst by building a military, and a strong military, in case German government becomes bad and decides to hurt France. So France builds up its military, and this scares Germany because Germany has to prepare for the worst possible scenario. And so it builds up its military. And France, of course, is more concerned now about the German military getting bigger. The Germans might say, well, you know, we're just trying to prepare for the worst possible situation. But you can see how this leads to a dilemma. One country's efforts to improve its security can lead to a decrease in the security of another country, unintentionally. And so supposedly the United States hegemony in Europe, domination of Europe after World War II, has overcome that security dilemma, the security dilemma, right? In other words, European Union, it could not exist without NATO. And do the Europeans believe that? You know, the way they behave seems to be the prevailing view. Yes, it's not the only view, but the prevailing view in Europe is that European Union cannot make an enemy of the United States, ever. Even if when the United States does stupid things, in their view. It can't, because the United States could break up European Union. European Union is too fragile, right? It's a club of member states. So let's talk about how the European Union was established, right? We talked about liberal intergovernmentalism last class, right? Last week. And we talked about how Franco-German cooperation is key to making European integration work. And the US has played a major role in the European integration process, right? The United States promoted European integration. The Americans, when they decided that, oh my God, Joseph Stalin wants to do what Adolf Hitler failed to do. And Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union already occupy half of Europe that they conquered on the way to Berlin to destroy the Nazi regime. And Western Europe is destroyed by World War II. Oh my gosh. So the Americans decided to provide aid and assistance to the Europeans, including economic aid and assistance, and under what this so-called Marshall Plan, named after the United States Secretary of State, George Marshall, who had been an American general in World War II, in charge of the chief of the American staff, military staff. And he became US Secretary of State, and he promised to the Europeans, with the agreement of the United States government, the United States would provide in today's money, hundreds of billions of dollars of loans and grants to Western Europe to recover from the destruction of World War II, get their economies growing again, and recovered from the devastating war. And the Americans did this mainly because they thought the Soviet Union was going to exploit the situation to expand its empire, in its view. So the United States provided this money, and the United States said, we want this money that we're giving and loaning to you to be used most effectively, so we don't want it wasted, which means we don't want it used by Western Germany to create a separate German steel industry that competes wastefully with the French steel industry, with an Italian steel industry, because we think that if we're France, we have to have a completely integrated, self-contained steel industry, because we might have to go to war with Germany. So we have to have our own steel industry so that we can build our own army to fight wars. And the Americans said, no, that's wasteful. You need to integrate your industries, your economies. You need to coordinate your economic policies to get the biggest bang for this buck, the biggest efficiency for the money that we're providing to you. So the United States insisted the Europeans integrate. And they found lots of people in Western Europe that were willing to, yes, support that integration, right? There had always been a long tradition in thought among certain segments of European intelligentsia supporting European integration, going way back, well, back to Rome for thousands of years, right? And they have always been around. And then with the end of World War II, fascists were removed from power, and these liberals emerged to replace them. They had always been there, but they had been tyrannized and scared by the fascists, and then they came back into power. After the Nazis were removed, people like Adenauer, Konrad Adenauer, the prime minister of West Germany after World War II, you know, he had long been a Catholic politician, but he was a liberal Catholic politician. He was an old man. He was already an old man when he became prime minister of Germany in the 1950s. He'd been around a long time, and of course, negatively because of the Cold War, the United States, and you know, a lot of Europeans were also concerned, maybe not as concerned about the Americans, that the Soviet Union was going to now launch from East Germany and conquer West Germany and Paris and Rome. But, you know, at this time, after World War II, Stalin, you know, was belligerent. Why was he belligerent? Was he belligerent because he thought, ha, I see an opportunity, and so I'm going to make these West Europeans bow to the Soviet hegemony because they now are so weak? Or was he belligerent because he was afraid of the British and the Americans? Yeah, because after all, keep in remember, the Soviet Union was destroyed. I mean, 27 million people died in the Soviet Union during World War II. 27 million. That's over half the population of South Korea. Gone in 4 years. Gone in 4 years. Can you imagine what that was like? 60% of its infrastructure, of its economic factories and infrastructure was gone, just destroyed. Overwhelming percentages of people who were young men were killed in the generation of the youngest people that served as soldiers. They were killed. They died in the war. 27 million dead. Did they really think that the Soviet Union, well, you know, the Americans say, well, Stalin doesn't care about how many people die. I mean, look what he did before the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. How many millions died in the Soviet Union because of Stalin's policies before the Germans invaded? You know, anyway, so but certainly by the time when Stalin died in 1953, the prevailing view in Western Europe was not as threatening in terms of seeing a threat from the Soviet Union as prevailed in the United States after Stalin passed in 53. So globalization, by the way, I mean, these are my comments. These are not in the book. You know, those parentheses mean my brackets mean my comments, right? And this is the beginning of globalization. So, boy, you know, West Germany got lucky in a sense after the horrible things that the Nazi regime did, the German Nazi regime did in Europe, to its own people and to the rest of Europe. You know, there was talk or discussion in the United States about these Germans. What are we going to do with these Germans? They started World War I. They started World War II. We've got to get rid of the German problem once and for all. So there was talk, for example, in the Morgenthau Plan, which you can look on Wikipedia, named after not Hans Morgenthau. Henry Morgenthau was the Secretary of Treasury of the United States, and he proposed a plan to make Germany into a big farm. A farming economy. No more steel and coal and industry for Germany because they can't have an army. So we're going to make them farmers, the Morgenthau Plan. But then the Americans decided, even before World War II was over, that the Soviet Union was going to be a problem. And Germany, West Germany would be useful to deal with that problem. And the German economy had to be developed because it was so important for the rest of Europe. If you want Italy and France to develop, to recover from the war, you need to get the Western Germans to recover as well from the war economically. And so the Cold War, it motivated the United States and London and Paris to agree to the reintegration of the occupation zones of occupied West Germany, because France had occupied part of Western Germany, the Americans occupied part, the British occupied part, and the Soviet Union occupied the eastern part of Germany, which became East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, until it collapsed in 1989, 1990. That occupation zone became Eastern Germany, that Soviet occupation zone. So the Americans agreed to integrate, and the British and the French, to integrate the three Western occupation zones over the objections of Stalin. Stalin didn't want that to happen. He said, we haven't settled what we're going to do with Germany yet here, what we're going to do about the German question. But of course, the French had this horrible experience with the Germans, so the integration of Germany with France, so that Germany really could not do anything without consulting with France, was a demand of the French, which the Americans supported through integration, through supporting the beginnings of integration after World War II. And this led to what became the Organization for European Economic Cooperation and Development, before the European Coal and Steel Community. The Organization for European Economic Cooperation and Development, which then became the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development later, and then South Korea would join that, I think, in the 1990s. It became a bigger organization beyond Europe, and for countries like South Korea, this is a point of pride. South Korea is officially a developed country because it belongs to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, right? But the OECD began before the European Coal and Steel Community. And so And the Federal Republic of Germany was formed out of the 3 occupation zones, and the Marshall Plan was adopted. And we already talked about the empty chair crisis. We talked about qualified majority. Well, okay. Well, yeah. The first moves to try to integrate Europe after World War II began before the European Coal and Steel Community, and even before the Organization for European Economic Cooperation and Development. Winston Churchill promoted what is now called today the Council of Europe. And the Council of Europe is a much bigger organization than the European Coal and Steel Community. It's even bigger than the European Union today. The Council of Europe is a human rights organization. Let's see if I can find it here. You know, I get these bright ideas that I want to look up in the midst of the session. But just to show you, I should always keep a Wikipedia page open so that I can show you the OECD. Let me see, let's go back to screen share. Here is the, no, that's not what I want. Here it is. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which began as the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. Now I want to show you the Council of Europe. And the Council of Europe is an older organization than any of these. The Council of Europe here is 47 members. The European Union has 27 members. You can see its members include Russia and Turkey, right? And this is a human rights organization. But in order for deciding what your Council of Europe would adopt as policies, all of the countries that belong to it have to agree to it. It's too much, it's too big, and it's too controversial. I mean, this began, beginnings of it, well, actually about the same time as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in the late 1940s. But this is before the European Coal and Steel Community. And it deals with human rights, and it's very important today. But the problem is that in order for the Council of Europe to decide anything, it requires all the countries have to agree, all 47 members. And when you're talking about human rights issues inside of a country, that is really a strong, provocative issue, and it can incite nationalist resistance inside countries. I mean, you can imagine after World War II, you know, the Germans are going to criticize French human rights policies in the 1950s. No way. How dare the Germans criticize anybody? Or the way the French are going to criticize German human rights policies? They can, but it generates a lot of political hostility because of nationalism, right? So, and if you're going to require unanimity, that everybody has to agree, all 47 member states, nothing or little is going to get done. So very quickly, the leaders of what became the European Union decided that they had to move more quickly in integrating, and they had to get rid of the requirement that everybody had to agree. So when they adopted the European Coal and Steel Community, they began to agree that when the ministers of the member states, and there were only 6 member states this time, right? West Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Netherlands, that they didn't all have to agree on how to regulate their coal and steel industries, that they would use majority voting or qualified majority voting. And that is important. I mean, and of course they could do it because it's less politically sensitive than, you know, talking about each other country's human rights record. I mean, you can imagine, you Koreans know about this, right? I mean, how sensitive, and the Japanese know this, right? How sensitive the Japanese are and the Koreans are to the issue of the comfort women and the treatment of the comfort women and so-called comfort women during the Japanese occupation. It just makes people furious. But when you're talking about business and coal and steel, people are a little less likely to get emotional, at least initially, right? So the US put in big money into the Marshall Plan. Again, because of the Americans believed that this isn't just good for Western Europe. This is necessary for American national security. That the Soviet Union wants to do what Nazi Germany tried to do. And it's bigger and it's stronger and it's already occupied half of Europe. It's already occupied half of Korea. It's already occupying China. They believe that Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists worked for Stalin, basically, that they are Stalin's henchmen. So that's wrong, but that's the stereotype, right? That there's this Soviet Union in this evil empire stereotype that Ronald Reagan called it in early 1980s, President of the United States. The Soviet Union is like Mordor, right? And Stalin is like Sauron. And Mao Zedong is like Saruman, and there's an evil empire that is spreading across the planet, right? And so that's why the Americans gave 3% of their gross national product in 1947 as aid to Western Europe, to get Western Europe to rebuild in order to help resist the evil empire. And the aid was conditional on the West European states cooperating, coordinating, and collaborating in their economic policies in order to increase economic efficiency and the impact of this money that the US was giving. Plus, the United States wanted to have markets to export its products. Remember, like we talked about the last class, well, not in the year, maybe not in this class, in the other class. At the end of World War II, the United States was almost almost half the world's gross economic output of the entire planet Earth was the United States, even with only 4.5% of the world's population. So the Americans have all this money and all this productive capacity. I mean, US industry, US economy had doubled in size during World War II. It had grown 100%. And the Americans would like to have a place to export their goods. And so that was another reason that the Americans gave this aid to Europe, because they wanted a market for their exports. But the primary motivation, not the only, but the primary one was that we got a problem with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is going to try to take advantage of the situation in Western Europe and take over all of Europe and Asia, and then us, the Americans. Since then, these are some principles. The Schengen Agreement, that's adopted later. That was adopted, 35 years ago in the town of Schengen, which removed any kind of toll booths and traffic stops. Whenever you cross a country's border in the European Union, you cross their borders, at least in theory, until the coronavirus pandemic crisis. You could cross from Belgium or France into Germany the same way you could cross from Gyeonggi-do in Korea to the next province in Korea. No stopping, nothing. And subsidiarity is this principle that appeals to this latent but still strong European nationalism, that the European Union will only take on those policy responsibilities that the member states themselves cannot adequately address, as the European member states themselves decide, right? But the European Union should only get involved in taxation policy or environmental policy if the member states decide that they can't do it individually on their own to address those problems. And that makes sense. For example, environmental policy, right? Climate change requires Europe and the whole world to cooperate. So it's not surprising that the European Union is taking a leading role in environmental policy. But when it comes to, for example, let us say, for example, pension policies, taking care of old people in your country, there is not an immediate reason for the European Union to be involved in coming up with a European pension policy. Of course, later there would emerge such a requirement due to neo-functional spillover, right? If you're going to have free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor, right? People might might live and work in Italy for 10 years, and then move to France and live and work there for 10 years, and then live and work in Germany for 20 years, and then retire in Belgium. Well, I mean, how are we going to regulate their pensions, given the fact they paid into the Italian pension system, the French pension system, the German pension system, and now they're living in Belgium as retirees? So, okay, maybe we need to come up with a European policy, but it only happens when the member states decide they need to make it a European Union member state issue, a European Union issue. But politically, it develops that way because of neo-functional spillover, policy networks as well, people sharing ideas, best practice across borders, professors, analysts, politicians, and just also the commitment, constructivist perspectives. We didn't talk about this last week, but this commitment of the elites of the European Union that this European integration process has to work. After 2 world wars, if there's a 3rd world war in Europe, there will be no more Europe and there will be no more world because it'll be a nuclear war. And, you know, keep that in mind, always in this class, this shadow of the 2nd World War. I mean, they fought World War I. World War I was a disaster. World War I was a disaster that the Europeans didn't want to happen, but it happened anyway. It was a war that nobody really wanted to fight. And nobody really wanted to start World War I. They fought it, obviously, but nobody really wanted to start it. But it started anyway. And then they agreed after World War I, never again. And, you know, Woodrow Wilson had this idea of a League of Nations, and that would be the beginning of Europe. It would really be the beginning of European integration. And it failed, and we had the rise of Mussolini and Hitler and fascism, and then we had World War II. And, you know, the Germans are lucky that they surrendered before the Americans finished developing the atomic bomb. Otherwise, the atomic bomb would have been dropped on Berlin instead of on Japan. And so, you know, this notion that we always have to keep in mind that this constructivist perspective that was covered in chapter 1, constructivism, this notion we are committed as the European establishment ruling authorities that have been in power since after World War II, that we have to make sure that this European integration process works. And so whenever we can, if we are faced with a crisis and a problem, we're going to respond with more European integration, not less. And that's being challenged. It's being challenged by people like Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage in Britain, because, you know, we talked briefly about this last class, right? That the British ruling class, a big portion of it, particularly in the not only, but in the Conservative, but also in the Labour Party, they've always been skeptical about European integration, partly because they don't think they necessarily need it, because they've had such a better positive history as British sovereigntists, as a United Kingdom sovereignty nation state than continental Europe. You know, Britain won World War I, Britain won World War II. British Empire was so big that we can still rely upon those connections to make Britain great again. And of course, in the United States, now we have Donald Trump in power, who also is not in favor of European integration, sees it as a threat. By the way, I want to talk about how these legacies of history are really important for understanding what goes on today. Like, for example, in the COVID-19 pandemic, I want to show you something that I think is interesting, if I can find it here, you know, sometimes, let me see here if I can find it. Did I put it someplace it shouldn't go? Oh, yeah, maybe I did. Well, I was going to show you how, for example, how the British are, AstraZeneca and Oxford are developing new vaccines, right? They're developing new vaccines, and that we see that AstraZeneca and Oxford are in the lead to produce this vaccine. And the British have already sent out parts of the vaccine to India to be produced in India, even though the trials to test the vaccine are not finished yet. And the India companies that produce most of the vaccine doses in the world are already ramping up production with this AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, even before it's been formally approved. And the Australians have also agreed to buy that vaccine. Again, seeing elements of how the legacy of the British Empire and this vaccine nationalism, as these countries rush to the whole world rushes to develop a vaccine, that the countries that develop the vaccine first will gain influence in countries where they become the leader in providing the vaccine. And Britain wants to maintain its connections in India and Australia, and I assume in Canada, although Canada is also developing with Chinese companies a vaccine. But there was a report just a couple of days ago about how Oxford and AstraZeneca, Australia has already agreed to buy like $1.5 billion, over $1 billion worth of vaccines from AstraZeneca and Oxford, even though the vaccine hasn't been approved yet. And India as well. And the Russians are trying a Russia vaccine, and the Chinese are working closely with the Indonesia and Philippines and in Africa, because everybody will have to be vaccinated. And this in this world in which countries compete indirectly, because we can't compete directly because we have nuclear weapons and it could lead to World War III. They're competing for influence and control with other parts of the world indirectly by offering aid and assistance and building policy networks and connections through, for example, vaccines and medical care. And so this is really important that the British vaccine be dominant in India and the former British Empire, because Britain particularly needs that former British Empire connection to be able to believe that it can thrive and prosper outside of the European Union, right? And the Americans are rushing with their vaccine by Pfizer and Moderna, and we already talked about the Chinese have 4 vaccines that they're developing and they're testing in Brazil and Africa and so on. So it's interesting to see how in this nuclear era where countries can't compete with each other directly because it could lead to violence and war, they're competing for influence and control in the world by offering alternative models and development and economic development and recovery in the case of pandemic routes and opportunities. And that's going to become even more so in the era of climate change, right? That so many poor countries are already overstressed now with the pandemic and their poverty and trying to overcome it. Now they have to deal with climate change. Who are you going to work with? The Americans, the European Union, the Chinese? Who? And with Donald Trump in office, he doesn't really care so much about the developing world, but China and the European Union do, right? So anyway, onward here. So the Schuman Plan, named after that French foreign minister, Robert Schuman, with a German name. A lot of these people, by the way, who were involved in the starting of the European Union, the European Coal and Steel Community, they were people that have individuals that had a connection with border communities. Like Robert Schuman, I mean, it's a German name, and he's French foreign minister. Jean Monnet, I think, came from a family of wine merchants that did business on the borderlands of Europe, and I can't remember exactly where. De Gasperi, the prime minister of Italy after World War II, his family was originally from the part of from Italy, but the part that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before it was unified in the 19th century. So the Schuman Plan, it resolved the problem of how to rebuild West Germany while lessening fears that a recovering Germany might use its power to dominate its neighbors. Remember, 2 world wars were fought with Germany. And this is just 6 years. I mean, I've been here in Korea for 11 years. 6 years ago was nothing. I know 6 years to you seems like an eternity because you're so young. When you get to my age, 6 years is, nothing. It was a plan to integrate the coal and steel industries of the 6 member states of the European Coal and Steel Community. Coal and steel were still at the time the foundation of hard power. Now, not so much, but at the time, it was. It was a plan drafted by Jean Monnet, named after the French foreign minister, and named after the French foreign minister Schuman, who staked his political life on it. I mean, this, like I told you, it's just 5 years after World War II, after the German occupation of France. Most of the French deeply distrusted Germany. And the Schuman Declaration of May 9th, 1950 announced the plan, and German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer endorsed the plan. I mean, I think he was already in his 70s when he became Prime Minister of Germany, maybe even older. It was open to all but theoretically, but only the Benelux countries, like Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany and Italy were ready and able to officially participate. Remember, Germany, France, and Italy were both challenged by the communist parties in their countries. As I told you, well, maybe I didn't mention, but I did in the other class, the American Foreign Policy class. You know, the Italian Communist Party, they claimed to be the leader of Italian resistance to the fascists and later the German occupation at the end of World War II. And the French Communist Party also claimed that they were the leaders of the resistance against the Vichy regime in Vichy, France, where the collaborationist regime was placed. I mean, to give you an idea of how influential the Italian Communist Party was in Italy, you know, I have Italian citizenship because Italy makes it easy for children of Italian immigrants like my father to have citizenship. See, here's my Italian passport, right? It says European Union, Unione Europea, Repubblica Italiana, Passaporto, right? Repubblica Italiana. And this is the symbol of the Italian state that was adopted after World War II. And what do you see? You see the red star of communist power highlighted in it, in the symbol, that 5-pointed star, right? It's red. It's red. And you see here a gear representing the workers, you know, in a factory. And sorry, have a question? Okay. And here you see also sheaves of wheat and, I don't know, looks like some agricultural product, the peasants. The workers and peasants, this gives you an indication of how influential the Italian Communist Party was immediately after World War II, how much prestige it had in Italy, right? And so the Alcide de Gasperi and the Americans as well wanted to keep the communists out of power, and they would succeed for doing some unpleasant things, but they would succeed. So the European Defense Community was an effort to build upon the European Coal and Steel Community, and it was signed in 1952. Again, the idea was to go one step further beyond coal and steel, and let's integrate the militaries of Germany and France. Remember, Stalin is still alive at this time, and you know, the idea was that Germany had to rearm. That Germany had to rearm because, you know, the Soviet Union could attack. And so the Germans need to have a military. And so we have to give the Germans a military. And so, and then of course the Korean War is going on at this time. The French had to agree to this. And the French negotiated, the French leaders negotiated the European Defense Community plan. And the French Parliament said, are you kidding me? We're going to let German officers and participate in commanding French military? Are you nuts? Of course, Stalin dies in 1953. Joseph Stalin dies in 1953, and the French Parliament rejected it in 1954. Despite this had been a French plan, right? So they compromised with the Western European Union established in 1954, under which the German army was reestablished in just 9 years after World War II. It included the UK and as well, the British and the 6 member states of the Coal and Steel Community, and Germany, which joined NATO also in 1955. And later this would be folded into the European Union. So this is not really significant today. The political embarrassment of the European Defense Community led the Europeans to focus on economic integration. Okay, I mean, this is a theme, right? That a lot of the European integration involves experimentation and efforts to do something to move forward. The original initiative in trying to bring about European integration began with human rights. That didn't work. It wasn't fast enough. So they started moving forward on economic and business because, you know, we have to do something to institutionalize cooperation among European peoples after the horrors of World War I and II. And the European Coal and Steel Community seemed to work. Yeah, so these European elites talking to each other and often not talking to the mass of the population, but talking to each other, Yeah, let's create a European defense community. Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do it. Yeah. Oh, the French Parliament said no. Okay, all right. Well, we'll keep moving forward on business and trade as the focus of integration. It's like riding a bicycle. You always have to keep going forward when you're riding a bicycle, right? Otherwise, you fall over. And sometimes as you go forward, you reach a bump, you hit a wall, but you can't stop, because if you stop, you fall over. So you go off in some other direction, right? And that's true today as well. The European Union responds to crises. It's responding to crises today regarding the coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic, and the economic crisis that's generated with countries like Italy and Spain. Their economies are going to collapse by 10%. Contract. We've never seen that since the Great Depression, since the 1930s. And the European Union is responding, so that the European Commission is getting more and more power to basically adopt a fiscal budget, fiscal policy for Europe, which it hasn't had. So we'll talk more about that later, because we're almost out of time. And we'll have to talk about the midterm at the next class. How about we do a poll? Yes, because I prepare these polls, and I want to use them. Let's see if I can find one that we can use. What did I do? I think I don't want to do that. Well, maybe not, because we're running out of time here. But let's see. I thought I had another poll ready to go here. Well, I guess I don't. I had another poll to use later. But just to, since we only have 2 minutes, okay, I'll talk about the midterm. So let's talk about the midterm. The midterm is here, and I will post this and talk more about it through the course of the weeks here. I want you to write a 450 to 500 word essay on this topic, which is taken from page 95 of the textbook. Which is more powerful, the impact of the European Union on its member states, or the impact of the member states on the European Union? And I want you to write a first draft of that, responding to that topic, and submit it on Cyber Campus assignments by Monday, 10th of October at 7 a.m. So you know how to do that. You've already been submitting paragraphs. And so this should be 450 to 500 words. You should use and cite information from at least 3 different chapters, from chapters 1 through 5 of the course textbook. So we are now in chapter 2 of the textbook. We'll get through 3 and 4 and 5, and then you will submit that paragraph. You will submit that paper to me, and then I will download it and write comments on it and send it back to you using the track function here, right? Like for example, I do this, and then I go, how about European Union EU policy making, using that track function like that, and then send it back to you. And then we will meet either virtually in Zoom or face to face. But I wouldn't be surprised if we stay virtual, virtual all semester, and talk to you individually about your paper. Okay. And then you revise the paper and get a grade on that revised paper, which you will submit the final draft of the paper by Tuesday, October 27th. So we don't need to talk about this now, because we've got a lot of time. I just wanted to show you this is something that the midterm that we're going to have in this class, a take-home exam. So we have to stop here. Does anybody have any questions? If not, then we have to stop, because I was told, other people use these accounts, so I have to get off this account so that somebody else can sign on. Are we done?
Professor?
Yeah.
I was late for about 7 minutes.
Well, you had 10 minutes to do that smart attendance. Did you do the smart attendance?
No, I couldn't interrupt the lecture, so
So this is Tong Chu Yu?
Yes.
Okay, send me an email, okay?
Okay.
Okay, I'll fix it. All right, that's all for today. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.